They were much more civilized and educated than the wraiths of the London sewers. He touched a comparatively sedate quartet of figures pending on the highest balcony, looking down calmly on the mayhem below them. I examined the grouping carefully and realized with a startled laugh that I recognized the golden-haired man. Solimena was greatly inspired by Carlyle's friends. He often painted them as gods. Edward chuckled. Ero, Marcus, Caius, he said, indicating the other three. Two black-haired, one snowy white. Nighttime patrons of the arts. What happened to them? I wondered out loud, my fingertip hovering a centimeter from the figures on the canvas. They're still there, he shrugged, as they have been for who knows how many millennia. Carlo stayed with them only for a short time, just a few decades. He greatly admired their civility, their refinement, but they persisted on trying to cure his aversion to his natural food source, as they called it. They tried to persuade him, and he tried to persuade them, to no avail. At that point, Carlo decided to try the New World. He dreamed of finding others like himself. He was very lonely, you see. He didn't find anyone for a long time, but as monsters became the stuff of fairy tales, he found that he could interact with unsuspecting humans as if he were one of them. He began practicing medicine, but the companionship he craved evaded him. He couldn't risk familiarity. When the influenza epidemic hit, he was working nights in a hospital in Chicago. He'd been turning over an idea in his mind for several years, and he'd almost decided to act. Since he couldn't find a companion, he would create one. He wasn't absolutely sure how his own transformation had occurred, so he was hesitant, and he was loath to steal anyone's life the way his had been stolen. It was in that frame of mind that he found me. There was no hope for me. I was left in a ward with the dying. He had nursed my parents and knew I was alone. He decided to try. His voice, nearly a whisper, trailed off. He stared unseeingly through the west windows. I wonder which images filled his mind now, Carlyle's memories or his own. I waited quietly. When he turned back to me, a gentle angel smile lit his expression. And so we've come full circle, he concluded. Have you always stayed with Carlo then? I wondered. Almost always. He put his hand lightly on my waist and pulled me with him as he walked through the door. I stared back at the wall of pictures, wondering if I would ever get to hear the other stories. Edward didn't say any more as we walked down the hall, so I asked, Almost? He sighed, seeming reluctant to answer. Well, I had a typical bout of rebellious adolescence. About 10 years after I was born, created, whatever you want to call it. I wasn't sold on his life of abstinence, and I resented him for curbing my appetite, so I went off on my own for a time. Really? I was intrigued rather than frightened as I perhaps should have been. He could tell. I vaguely realized that we were headed up the next flight of stairs, but I wasn't paying much attention to my surroundings. That doesn't reproach you? No. Why not? I guess it sounds reasonable. He barked aloud, more loudly than before. We're at the top of the stairs now in another paneled hallway. From the time of my new birth, he murmured, I had the advantages of knowing what everyone around me was thinking, both human and non-human alike. That's why it took me 10 years to defy Carlyle. I could read his perfect sincerity, understand exactly why he lived the way he did. It took me only a few years to return to Carlyle and recommit to his vision. I thought that I would be exempt from the depression that accompanies a conscience, because I knew the thoughts of my prey. I could pass over the innocent and pursue only the evil. If I followed a murderer down a darkened alley where he stalked a young girl, if I saved her, then surely I wasn't so terrible. I shivered, imagining only too clearly what he described. The alley at night, the frightened girl, the dark man behind her, and Edward. Edward as he hunted, terrible and glorious as a young god, unstoppable. Would she have been grateful, that girl, or more frightened than before? But as time went on, I began to see the monster in my eyes. I couldn't escape the debt of so much human life taken, no matter how justified. And I went back to Carlisle and Esme. They welcomed me back like the prodigal. It was more than I deserved. We come to a stop in front of the last door in the hall. My room, he informed me, opening it and pulling me through. His room faced south, with the wall-sized window like the great room below. The whole backside of the house must be glass. His view looked down on the widening Soul Duck River, across the untouched forest to the Olympic mountain range. The mountains were much closer than I would have believed. The western wall was completely covered with shelf after shelf of CDs. His room was better stocked than a music store. In the corner was a sophisticated-looking sound system, the kind I was afraid to touch because I'd be sure to break something. There was no bed, only a wide and inviting black leather sofa. The floor was covered with a thick golden carpet, and the walls were hung with heavy fabric in a slightly darker shade. Good acoustics, I guessed. He chuckled and nodded. He picked up a remote and turned the stereo on. It was quiet, but the soft jazz number sounded like the band was in the room with us. I went to look at his mind-boggling music collection. "How do you have these organized?" I asked, unable to find any rhyme or reason to the titles. He wasn't paying attention. By year, and then by personal preference within that frame," he said absently. I turned, and he was looking at me with a peculiar expression in his eyes. What? I was prepared to feel relieved, having you know everything, not needing to keep secrets from you, but I didn't expect to feel more than that. I like it. It makes me happy. He shrugged, smiling slightly. "I'm glad," I said, smiling back. I'd worried that he might regret telling me these things. It was good to know that that wasn't the case. But then, as his eyes dissected my expression, his smile faded and his forehead creased. "You're still waiting for the running and screaming, aren't you?" I guessed. A faint smile touched his lip, and he nodded. "I hate to burst your bubble, but you're really not as scary as you think you are. I don't find you scary at all, actually," I lied casually. He stopped, raising his eyebrow in blatant disbelief. Then he flashed a wide, wicked smile. "You really shouldn't have said that," he chuckled. He growled, a low sound in the back of his throat. His lips curled back over his perfect teeth. His body shifted suddenly, half crouched tense like a lion about to pounce. I backed away from him, glaring. "You wouldn't." I didn't see him leap at me. It was much too fast. I only found myself suddenly airborne, and then we crashed onto the sofa, knocking it onto the wall. All the while, his arms formed an iron cage of protection around me. I was barely jostled, but I was still grasping as I tried to wrap myself. He wasn't having that. He curled me into the ball of his chest, holding me more securely than iron chains. I glared at him in alarm, but he seemed well in control. His jaw was relaxed and he was grinning, his eyes bright with only humor. "You were saying," he growled playfully, "that you're a very, very terrifying monster," I said, my sarcasm mirrored by my bit of breathlessness in my voice. "Much better," he approved. I struggled. "Can I get up now?" He just laughed. "Can we come in?" A soft voice sounded from the end of the hall. I struggled to free myself, but Edward nearly readjusted me so that I was somewhat more conveniently seated on his lap. I could see it was Alice, and then Jasper behind her in the doorway. My cheeks burned, but Edward seemed at ease. "Go ahead," he said, still chuckling quietly. Alice seemed to find nothing unusual in our embrace as she walked. She almost danced. Her movements were so graceful to the center of the room, where she folded herself simultaneously on the floor. Jasper, however, paused at the door, his expression trifled shocked. He stared at Everett's face, and I wondered if he was testing the atmosphere with his unusual sensitivity. "It sounded like you were having Bella for lunch, and we came to see if we can share," Alice announced. I stiffened for an instant, until I realized Everett was grinning. Whether at her comment or my response, I couldn't tell. "Sorry, I don't believe I have enough to spare," he replied, his arms holding me recklessly close.